Hey YouTube, Ethan here. So we've talked a lot about cooling on this channel, whether it's taming a metal volcano, cooling oxygen coming from a SPOM to be used in your base, water and other liquids that you're also using within your base, or a massive geothermal generator. One thing that's been noticeably absent in these videos is the best cooling substance. Like anything with oxygen not included, this topic can get quite deep. So today, let's answer the question, what is the best liquid that can be used for cooling and oxygen not included? Before getting ahead of ourselves, let's take a look at key terms and factors that contribute to cooling in something and oxygen not included. The game is far more complicated than simply finding any liquid available, sending it through an aqua tuner, and then using it to cool a solid, liquid, or a gas. We need to take a look at some key terms and what they mean in order to understand cooling to its full extent. The first term that I want to introduce is the freezing point, or FP. This is the temperature at which the liquid that you're using turns into a solid once it gets cold enough. And the second term is vaporization point, or VP, and this is the temperature at which the liquid turns into a gas. These are fairly basic concepts, but they're incredibly important to remember when you're trying to cool or heat something up. For instance, if you're using something like water, water is going to freeze when it gets below 0 degrees Celsius. This means that if you have it running through a radiant liquid pipe and you're cooling it down to be used for removing heat somewhere else, it's going to turn into ice and break the liquid pipe. On the flip side, if you're trying to cool something with it that is very hot and the temperature of the water gets above 100 degrees Celsius, it's going to turn into a gas and also break your liquid pipe. Either scenario is going to entirely halt your cooling or heating operation, and this is obviously something that you want to avoid if you're trying to build a self-sustaining system. I would argue that these are the two most important traits you want to remember, because no matter what other substance that you're trying to use to cool or heat something, it can be done with pretty much any liquid simply at an extra cost, but exceeding the vaporization point or freezing point of the liquid that you're using is going to break your build entirely. The third term that I want to focus on is DTU, duplicate thermal units. Duplicate thermal units is what heat production and oxygen not included is measured in. You will see this on most buildings such as generators, batteries, and lighting, but usually referenced in kDTUs, meaning kilo DTUs. A kDTU simply means 1000 DTUs, and is often used for measuring buildings such as generators, batteries, and even light fixtures. You'll see this term used a lot in the game, but the main thing that you want to remember is that the higher the DTU is, the more heat is produced, or in the context of heating liquids, the more heat is needed. Beyond this, I don't believe there's any additional context that you need for DTUs for the purposes of this video. If you would like to do more research into how DTUs are calculated, you can use the Oxygen Not Included wiki for more detailed information. The last two are the big ones, and arguably the most complicated. Specific heat capacity, or SHC. This defines how much heat energy it takes to heat up a unit of mass by 1 unit of temperature, which applies to Fahrenheit or Celsius. This is typically shown as DTU per gram per degree of Celsius. For example, crude oil has an SHC of 1.69 DTU per gram per Celsius, meaning that heating 1 gram of crude oil by 1 degree of Celsius requires 1.69 DTUs. The next is thermal conductivity. This is the measure of how fast heat moves through a material. If something has a high thermal conductivity, it will quickly transfer heat. This can be great for moving heat out of hot areas. Low thermal conductivity means it's an insulator, and that heat moves through very slowly. This matters most when you have a building that you're trying to keep cool or very hot. Now that we know what the terms mean and we've got that out of the way, let's take a look at the most common liquids and oxygen not included that you would normally use for cooling and focus on their efficiency ranked by their SHC. This is my list for the best liquids that you want to use in oxygen not included when it comes to cooling. So let's start with the first one, which is polluted water, which is an SHC of 4.1. Polluted water is generally the second most readily available substance when you start a new asteroid other than water. You'll likely always start with a little bit of water, and polluted water won't be too far out of your reach. However, before you even need polluted water for cooling, you'll likely already be producing your own from either carbon skimmers or from your washrooms. Water comes in at second place, also with an SHC of 4.1. Even though they have identical SHCs, polluted water is often preferred because its freezing point is a lot lower, so you can handle slightly more extreme temperatures than you can with water. Polluted water also has a higher vaporization point, which means it can also handle higher heat loads than water can. Salt water comes in at number 3, also at 4.1 SHC. It is arguably better than water because it also has a freezing point that is lower than 0, but it's a lot harder to acquire than polluted water or water. You'll likely only come across this in certain biomes that are much farther out of reach from your pod location, and especially from certain geysers. Brine comes in at number 4 with an SHC of 3.4. This is usually not preferred as a cooling method because it's much harder to acquire than the previous 3 that I mentioned, and it also has a lower SHC, so it's usually not preferred anyways. Ethanol comes in at number 5 with an SHC of only 2.46. The benefit of using something like ethanol is that it can be cooled to very low negative temperatures. It won't freeze until it gets to negative 114 degrees Celsius. This is countered by a very low vaporization point at only 78 degrees Celsius. Ethanol will definitely be your number one cooling method if you want to cool something into a deep frozen state before you get to late game materials. Petroleum and crude oil fill out this list with an SHC of 1.76 and 1.69 respectively. Despite their low SHC, they do have a high thermal conductivity, although that doesn't help them stack up very well against polluted water or water, and we'll see that in just a minute. The main benefit of using something like petroleum or crude oil is the insane temperature variations that they can withstand. Crude oil can go up to 399 degrees Celsius, and petroleum can go all the way up to 538 degrees Celsius. This is an insane temperature range, so if you're trying to cool something that is very hot, then either of these two liquids are your ways to go. Number 8 on the list is nectar, only because you need to have the Frosty Planet DLC in order to use it. It has an SHC of 1.4, just like polluted water does, thermal conductivity of water, and an insane temperature range when compared to polluted water or regular water. It will freeze at negative 82 degrees Celsius, and it can go all the way up to 160 degrees Celsius before it starts to break your build. Finally, it's without question that supercoolant is the number one cooling liquid in the game. With an SHC of 8.4 and a TC of 9.4, this by far exceeds every other substance on this list. It also has a freezing point of negative 271 degrees Celsius and a vaporization point just between crude oil and petroleum at 436 degrees Celsius. This is very hard to unlock as you have to have access to space in order to get the materials needed to make supercoolant. But objectively, this is something that you want to aim for a long-term playthrough. Of course, there are other liquids that you can use for cooling, and you can also use gases. But the reason they're off the list is because either they don't stack up nearly as well as these liquids do, or they're too much of a nuisance to acquire in order to include them on the list. Having said this, you might think to yourself, how does this information translate to an in-game scenario? We're going to put all these liquids in a test and see which one performs the best after going through all of their in-game statistics. Alright, so here are the 9 liquids that we went over in the previous slide, starting with polluted water, water, salt water, brine, ethanol, petroleum, crude oil, nectar, and supercoolant. As you just saw, all of the liquids are starting at 10 degrees Celsius. These liquids will be pumped through insulated pipes, which will then enter radiant liquid pipes that are going to snake around metal chambers filled with petroleum that is at 80 degrees Celsius, give or take a fraction of a degree, and the coolants are going to race to see which is the most effective at cooling it all the way down to 0 degrees Celsius. They're all going to run through their very own thermal aqua tuner, and they will all be turned on exactly at the same time with automation. Likewise with the liquid pumps. Taking a closer look at the metal tiles, they're all made out of steel, with diamond temp shift plates filling in the void behind the petroleum. Obviously, they're all inside of a vacuum, and this is very important because otherwise there would be heat transfer between the various different chambers. There's a thermal sensor in each chamber which is hooked up to an automatic notifier, and this should pause the game when the petroleum reaches below 1 degree Celsius. So let's go ahead and start the liquid pumps and turn on the thermal aqua tuners. As we wait for all the liquids to start cooling down in the aqua tuners and removing heat from the petroleum, we'll discuss what we expect to happen during this scenario. Obviously, there's going to be one clear winner here at the very end, and that's very likely going to be the supercoolant. We should expect that the polluted water, the salt water, and the nectar come in second at around roughly the same time period. This is because of their very high SHC that we talked about earlier. We'll be skipping through and fast forwarding because obviously it would take a very long time to sit through and wait for every single one of these liquids to finish. Since a few seconds has passed in the very first cycle of the system running, let's take a look at how everything is going. The supercoolant has already cooled down the petroleum to 36 degrees and it's rapidly dropping. The nectar's at 55, crude oil and petroleum are at 67, ethanol is at 63, brine is at 55, salt water 52, water 51, and polluted water is also at 51 and dropping rapidly. Let's check back when the supercoolant has gotten to 0 degrees and we'll compare where the other liquids are at. We're rapidly approaching our first winner. And here it is. It's no surprise that it's the supercoolant. Let's take a look at how the supercoolant did compared to the other liquids that we tested. The supercoolant was able to get the petroleum to just below 1 degree Celsius. For comparison, the polluted water is still at 36 degrees Celsius. The water is also at 36 degrees Celsius. The salt water is also at 36 degrees Celsius. The brine is at 43 degrees. Ethanol at 52. Petroleum and crude oil are at 60. And nectar at 36. Supercoolant is the undisputed winner when it comes to any of your cooling needs. But of course, this is something something that you don't have access to as a new player, so let's keep going and see which liquid finishes second, because undoubtedly that's the liquid that you'll want to be using until you have access to the supercoolant. We're still on cycle 496, just after the supercoolant has won, and we've come across our first bottleneck. The water inside of the insulated liquid pipes is nearing its freezing point, and this means if I continue the experiment, eventually this liquid is going to freeze, break the pipes, and stop working altogether. So I have no choice but to remove the water from contention, and it will not be able to proceed at getting the petroleum all the way down to 0 degrees Celsius. This is just one of the disadvantages of using water as a coolant. But because we're stopping the experiment at the same time for all of the other liquids, let's take a look and see how the water would rank against all of the other liquids in competition. The petroleum that the polluted water was cooling is at 17.5 degrees Celsius. The petroleum for the water is also 17.5. The salt water is 18.5. The brine is 27.8. The ethanol is 41. The petroleum is 51. The crude oil is 52. And the nectar is 18.5. This means that the water is actually tied with the polluted water at being the second best coolant in the game when it's used from decreasing the petroleum temperature from 80 degrees Celsius to as low as it can go before the water is reaching its freezing point. The salt water has changed state and it has fallen out of competition. This is the exact same thing that would have happened to the water if I continued to let the aqua tuner run. So we're going to ignore it for now. And just as that happens, the polluted water has officially come into second place, as it has cooled the petroleum down to below 1 degree Celsius. With the polluted water officially in second place, let's see how it compared to the rest of the liquids. The salt water, just as it was breaking, was able to get the petroleum down to about 6 degrees Celsius. The brine still has a way to go at around 14 degrees Celsius. The ethanol is at 30 degrees Celsius, the petroleum is at 43 degrees Celsius, and the crude oil is around 45 degrees Celsius. The nectar, surprisingly, is just behind the polluted water at around 2 degrees Celsius. So I think there's a pretty clear winner here. But more importantly, there are very good secondary options to use instead of the supercoolant if you're trying to cool something down very quickly and maintain that temperature. Polluted water is readily accessible throughout your entire asteroid for the most part, and it comes in as the clear number 2 at cooling a substance down from 80 degrees Celsius to 0 degrees Celsius. Water is right behind that, but you're going to have to use some automation in order to keep the water from entirely freezing, otherwise it's going to break your build. Salt water is very close, but it's going to have the similar problem as the water. Brine lags a little bit behind, and to be honest, it's something that I would completely avoid using, but there are some players that like using it. If you have the resources available, nectar is my obvious second choice because of its capacity to be very low negative temperatures and very high positive temperatures compared to the polluted water. Ethanol, petroleum, and crude oil are not very good at all when compared to the other liquids that are more readily available. However, they might be useful in more niche scenarios where you are dealing with more extreme temperature variations. So in conclusion, what did we learn from this demonstration? We learned that supercoolant, as the name suggests, is by far the best coolant in the entire game. Polluted water, nectar, regular water, and salt water come in a very close second, but you have to respect their tolerances of freezing points and vaporization points in order to use them at their maximum efficiency. You might also consider how easy the substance is to acquire when making your selection. Things like ethanol, petroleum, and crude oil are not very good when compared to the rest of the competition, but they do have their uses if you're dealing with extreme temperatures in the negatives or in the positives before you have supercoolant. These are just some of the factors you might want to ask yourself when you're choosing the right coolant for the right application. My personal hot take on the entire coolant situation is that you can use whatever coolant you want and whatever coolant you have readily available. The downside to using something like crude oil, petroleum, or ethanol is that you're going to use more power in the long run with these liquids as a cooling substance. And the difference is not trivial. That being said, can you use crude oil for many applications? Absolutely. I've used crude oil, ethanol, and polluted water in my geothermal setup that I showed in a previous video. The main advantage from the polluted water in this scenario is that you're able to cool many more steam turbines than you can with the polluted water and the ethanol. And of course, that's showcased in this geothermal setup. But as you can see, the crude oil and ethanol is working completely fine, and all 3 aqua tuners are going to be running at 100%. So in a situation like this, unless you're trying to maximize the usage of your polluted water, you're not going to significantly hurt yourself by using something like crude oil. So if that's what you have readily available next to your build, go ahead and use it. Just be aware of the downfalls if you're trying to maximize the efficiency in the long run of your playthrough. So I hope this video was helpful for you, and it can help you decide what to use for cooling next time you come across a scenario where you're trying to cool a solid, liquid, or a gas. As I've said in the beginning, there are other methods of cooling as well. This video particularly focused on liquids. There's not one right way to cool something in your playthrough in oxygen not included, but there is a best way. And if you don't have access to the best way, there's a second best way. Ultimately, what matters during your playthrough is that you're constantly learning, so when you decide to start a new asteroid, you don't make the same mistakes as you made on your last one that allow you to get farther into the game than before. If this video was helpful for you, please be sure to leave it a rating, as this means a lot to me and it helps the video get to more people in the algorithm. Also, if you're not subscribed, be sure to do so because I have a lot more oxygen not included content to come. Until next time, I'm Ethan, and I'll see you guys in the next one.